The moment is burned into my memory like a photograph I can't throw away. I was standing beside the polished granite conference table, organizing quarterly reports into pristine manila folders. The morning sun filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the boardroom of Thornfield Industries. Sir Vincent Blackwood sat at the head of the table, his Armani suit pressed to perfection, that familiar condescending smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Alexia," he said, my name dripping with dismissal. "You're just a secretary, not a financial analyst. Maybe focus on answering phones instead of pretending you understand corporate strategy, The executives around the table chuckled like trained seals. Heat crept up my neck, but I kept my expression neutral. I simply nodded and placed the folder in front of him with steady hands. I had been at Thornfield Industries for 6 years. Started as a receptionist, gradually worked my way up to executive assistant. But somewhere along the way, I became something more. The person who caught discrepancies others missed. The one who remembered every detail buried in 1,000-page regulatory filings. The silent guardian who'd saved this company from costly mistakes more times than anyone knew. But to Vincent, I was invisible furniture. Useful when needed, ignored when not. The meeting was about our biggest venture yet, a merger with a German automotive supplier worth $120 million. The room practically vibrated with excitement. Vincent was already planning his victory lap, the press conferences, the stock price surge that would cement his legacy. But as I handed him the final compliance report, my stomach twisted into knots. "There's something here you should have legal review," I said quietly, pointing to a section near the back. "Page 247, the environmental liability clause." Vincent barely glanced at it. "Leave it, Alexia." I looked him directly in the eye. "It's a potential issue. The subsidiary has 3 pending EPA violations that weren't disclosed. If they're found liable after the merger." Vincent's laugh cut through the room like a blade. "Alexia, please. I have a team of Harvard MBAs and top-tier lawyers handling this. If they're not concerned, neither am I. I don't pay you to think." The room fell dead silent. Some smirked. Others studied their phones. I nodded once. "Understood, sir." But something inside me shifted that day. 4 years, I'd swallowed the condescension, the casual dismissals, the glass ceiling that seemed to lower every time I tried to stand tall. I told myself it was the price of staying in the game, of learning from the inside. But this was different. This wasn't just arrogance, it was reckless negligence. And I wasn't going to stand by and watch him drive this company into the ground. That night, I stayed late under the pretense of organizing files for the next day's meetings. The cleaning crew nodded at me as they passed. After all, Alexia the secretary was always there, always invisible, always working. But I wasn't organizing files. I was reading. Every word, every footnote, every cross-reference in that merger agreement. And what I discovered made my blood run cold. The environmental liability clause wasn't just concerning, it was a ticking time bomb. The German subsidiary had 3 major EPA violations pending, with potential fines totaling $45 million. Worse, there was a clause that made the acquiring company retroactively liable for any environmental damages dating back 5 years. Vincent's Harvard MBAs had missed it completely. I stared at the legal text until my eyes burned. My hands trembled, but not with fear. With something sharper, more focused. For the first time, I realized the real power in this building wasn't held by the people in corner offices. It was held by the people who actually read the fine print. I made a decision that night that would change everything. But I wasn't reckless. I needed a plan, and more importantly, I needed leverage. Because Vincent Blackwood was about to learn that underestimating Alexia Chen was the biggest mistake of his career. The next morning, the office hummed with its usual rhythm. Coffee brewing, phones ringing, the steady tap of keyboards creating white noise. I sat at my desk outside Vincent's office, reviewing emails and managing his calendar. On the surface, I looked exactly like what they thought I was, the dutiful secretary who knew her place. But folded in my purse was a printed email I'd sent the night before to the EPA's whistleblower hotline, complete with detailed documentation of the environmental violations Vincent's team had overlooked. I'd also made copies of every relevant document and stored them in a secure cloud account under a pseudonym. I wasn't going to sabotage the company. I was going to save it from Vincent's negligence. At 11:30 a.m., I made a call that would set everything in motion. Environmental Protection Agency, Whistleblower Division, came the crisp voice on the other end. I'd like to report potential environmental law violations related to a pending corporate merger, I said calmly, using a voice modulator app I downloaded on my personal phone. Within 2 hours, everything changed. At 1:45 p.m., 2 EPA investigators arrived at our offices. They spoke in low, serious tones with our legal team. Vincent's voice carried through his office walls, sharp, angry, confused. By 3 p.m., the entire legal department was in crisis mode. Papers scattered across conference tables. Phones ringing constantly. Hushed conversations in hallways. I kept my head down, typing meeting notes, answering phones, pretending not to notice the chaos swirling around me. That afternoon, Vincent stormed past my desk without his usual swagger. The man who dismissed me 18 hours earlier looked like he'd aged 5 years. I went home that night with my heart pounding, not from fear, but from something else entirely. A strange mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. It was working. But I knew men like Vincent Blackwood didn't go down quietly. They fought dirty. They crushed anyone who threatened their empire. And I had just painted a target on my back. The next morning, my phone buzzed before I even reached the office parking lot. Vincent Blackwood flashed across the caller ID. I let it ring twice before answering. Alexia, his voice was controlled but tight. I need you in my office. Now. Of course, sir, I replied, my voice steady as glass. As I walked through the office toward his door, I felt every pair of eyes following me. But this time, I didn't feel small. I felt ready. Because Vincent was about to discover that this secretary didn't just know how to file papers and answer phones. I knew how to play chess. And I was already 3 moves ahead. Vincent's office felt different that morning. The air was thicker, charged with tension. He stood with his back to me, staring out at the city skyline, hands clasped behind his back like a general contemplating defeat. Close the door, he said without turning around. I did. Alexia, he began, finally facing me. His usual confidence was cracked, hairline fractures showing through his corporate armor. Sit down. I sat. He remained standing, pacing behind his desk like a caged animal. The EPA received an anonymous tip about our merger, he said slowly. Someone with intimate knowledge of our deal structure contacted them about environmental violations we allegedly overlooked. I kept my expression neutral. That sounds serious. His eyes narrowed. It is serious. Serious enough to potentially kill a $120 million deal and destroy this company's reputation. He stopped pacing and leaned forward, hands planted on his desk. The question is, who would do such a thing? I met his gaze steadily. I imagine anyone concerned about potential legal liability would want proper disclosure. Cut the act, Alexia. His voice dropped to a whisper. I know it was you. I tilted my head slightly. I'm not sure what you mean. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. You warned me about environmental issues yesterday. Today, the EPA shows up with detailed documentation about those exact same issues. You think I'm stupid? I think you dismissed my concerns without investigation, I replied calmly. Just like you always do. For a moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched between us like a wire ready to snap. Then he circled back to his chair and sat down, folding his hands. What do you want? Excuse me. Come on, let's not play games. You saw an opportunity to grab some leverage, maybe get a promotion, a raise, whatever. Fine. Name your price. I'll make this worth your while if you help me clean up this mess. I looked at him for a long moment. You think this is about money? Everything's about money, Alexia. That's how the world works. I shook my head slowly. You still don't get it, do you? His confident mask slipped further. Get what? This isn't about money, Vincent. This is about accountability. For 6 years, I've watched you dismiss anyone who doesn't have the right degree, the right connections, the right last name. You've made critical decisions based on ego instead of evidence. And now, your negligence is about to cost this company everything. His face flushed red. You have no idea what it takes to run a company this size. I know what it takes to read a contract, I interrupted. I know what it takes to do due diligence. I know what it takes to listen when someone tries to help you avoid a catastrophic mistake. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with new eyes. You realize you've just destroyed your own career, right? Even if you think you're protecting this company, the board will never trust you again. You'll be blacklisted from every corporate job in the city. I gave him a small, sad smile. Maybe. But at least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror. You're making a mistake, Alexia. I stood up and smoothed my blazer. No, Vincent. You made the mistake. I'm just making sure everyone knows about it. I walked to the door, then paused with my hand on the handle. Oh, and Vincent? The EPA investigation is just the beginning. Wait until the board finds out you knew about the environmental issues and chose to ignore them. His face went pale. You wouldn't dare. I turned and met his eyes one final time. Try me. Then I left his office and returned to my desk, knowing that the war had officially begun. The hours after our confrontation felt like the calm before a hurricane. I sat at my desk, managing Vincent's calendar and answering his calls as if nothing had happened. But underneath the surface, I could feel the tremors. By late afternoon, the fallout began. At 4:15 p.m., I received an email from HR requesting my immediate presence for a routine performance review. I forwarded it to the employment attorney I'd hired 2 days earlier, because I wasn't walking into this fight unarmed. At 4:30 p.m., I sat across from the head of HR and a company lawyer I'd never seen before. Alexia, the HR director began, we've received concerning reports about your recent conduct. Specifically, allegations that you may have shared confidential company information with outside parties. I placed a folder on the table between us. These are copies of every document I referenced in my EPA report. All of them are publicly available through SEC filings or were disclosed in board meetings I was present for. Nothing confidential was shared. The lawyer frowned as he flipped through the papers. Be that as it may, your actions have created a significant crisis for this company. My actions brought attention to legal violations that could have bankrupted this company, I interrupted. If that's a crisis, it's one of Vincent Blackwood's making, not mine. The HR director shifted uncomfortably. We're simply trying to understand why you felt it necessary to go outside the company instead of working through proper channels. I leaned forward. I did work through proper channels. I brought my concerns directly to the CEO. He dismissed them without investigation and told me, and I quote, I don't pay you to think. Silence fell over the room. Do you have documentation of this conversation? The lawyer asked. I pulled out my phone and played a recording. Vincent's voice filled the room. You're just a secretary, not a financial analyst. Maybe focus on answering phones instead of pretending you understand corporate strategy. The HR director's face went white. I've been documenting concerning behavior for months, I continued. This company has a pattern of ignoring critical issues raised by lower-level employees. The EPA situation is just the latest example. The lawyer closed the folder. We'll need to review this internally. Of course, I said, standing. My attorney will be expecting your call. As I left the HR office, I knew Vincent's next move would be more aggressive. But I was ready. Because while he'd been building his empire on arrogance and intimidation, I'd been building my case on facts and evidence. And facts don't care about corner offices or executive titles. The next morning brought news that changed everything. I arrived at the office to find Vincent's assistant clearing out her desk, tears streaming down her face. The executive floor was eerily quiet, like a morgue after visiting hours. At 9 a.m. sharp, an email landed in everyone's inbox. The subject line made my heart skip, executive leadership changes, effective immediately. Vincent Blackwood was stepping down as CEO, pending the outcome of an internal investigation. The board had appointed our chief financial officer, David Chin, no relation, despite the shared surname, as interim CEO. But the real earthquake came in the second paragraph. The EPA investigation had uncovered multiple environmental violations that could result in fines exceeding $60 million. The German merger was suspended indefinitely. Vincent's empire was crumbling, and he knew exactly who had lit the match. At 10:30 a.m., security escorted Vincent from the building. As he passed my desk with a box of personal belongings, he stopped and looked at me. "I hope you're satisfied," he said quietly. I met his gaze without flinching. "I'm satisfied that this company might survive your leadership." He shook his head and kept walking. I never saw him again. That afternoon, David Chen called me into his office. Unlike Vincent's monument to ego, David's office was modest, functional, focused on work rather than intimidation. "Alexia," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "I've been reviewing the events of the past week. I need to understand exactly what happened." For the next hour, I walked him through everything. The ignored warnings, the environmental violations, Vincent's dismissive attitude, my decision to contact the EPA. I held nothing back. When I finished, David leaned back in his chair. "You saved this company from a catastrophic mistake." I did what anyone in my position should have done. He shook his head. "No, you did what someone with exceptional judgment and courage would do. Most people would have kept quiet and let the disaster unfold." I waited, unsure where this conversation was heading. "The board wants to offer you a position," he continued. "Director of Risk Management and Compliance. You'd report directly to me and have full authority to investigate and escalate any concerns without going through traditional hierarchies." I blinked. "That's a real position?" David smiled. "It is now. We need someone who isn't afraid to speak truth to power. Someone who puts the company's welfare above personal comfort." I thought about it for a moment. I'd want complete independence. No retaliation for raising concerns, no matter how inconvenient they might be. Done. And I want a seat at the table for all major decisions. No more being dismissed as just a secretary. You'll have full executive status. I extended my hand. "Then I accept." As we shook hands, David said, "Can I ask you something? Why did you stay quiet for so long? You clearly have the skills for executive leadership." I considered the question. I thought if I worked hard enough, proved myself enough, eventually I'd be recognized. I learned the hard way that sometimes you have to demand respect instead of hoping someone will give it to you. He nodded. "Well, you've certainly earned it now." The next month was a whirlwind of restructuring and damage control. The EPA fines were negotiated down to $35 million, still devastating, but not company-ending. The German merger was reworked with proper environmental due diligence, ultimately saving Thornfield Industries from what would have been a $90 million liability. My new role gave me the authority I'd always needed but never had. I implemented new compliance protocols, hired additional risk analysts, and created direct reporting channels for employees to raise concerns without fear of retaliation. 6 months later, I was sitting in the same conference room where Vincent had dismissed me as just a secretary. But now I sat at the table, not beside it. The quarterly board meeting was reviewing our recovery from the environmental crisis. "I have to say," said Board Chair Margaret Hoffman, "your risk management protocols have transformed our decision-making process. We're catching potential issues months earlier than we used to." I nodded professionally. That's what happens when you listen to everyone, not just the people with corner offices. After the meeting, I walked to the window and looked out at the city skyline. Somewhere out there, Vincent Blackwood was probably starting over at a smaller company, hopefully having learned something from his fall. But that wasn't my concern anymore. I'd learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to be invisible. Refuse to be dismissed. Refuse to let someone else's arrogance destroy what you've worked to build. I didn't set out to destroy Vincent Blackwood's career. I set out to save my company from his negligence. The fact that justice and necessity aligned so perfectly, that was just good fortune. As I returned to my office with my name on the door and my voice at the table, I thought about all the other just secretaries and just assistants and just analysts sitting in offices around the world, watching their leaders make preventable mistakes. My story wasn't about revenge. It was about responsibility. And sometimes, the most responsible thing you can do is make sure the right person is held accountable, even if that person happens to be the most powerful person in the room. Especially if that person happens to be the most powerful person in the room. Because power without accountability isn't leadership. It's just ego with a corner office. And ego, as Vincent Blackwood learned the hard way, is no match for someone who's willing to do the right thing, regardless of the consequences. Some battles you fight to win. Others you fight because not fighting means letting the wrong side win by default. I chose to fight. And in the end everyone, even Vincent, was better for it. Even if he'll never admit it.